Here we have the 10-7 offsuit. Small blind raises to 2.5 big blinds, 40 big blinds deep. I would just call here the vast majority of the time. I mean, if you think your opponent is very, very loose, making a small raise, I would at least consider 3-betting. But typically you're going to find that when people make small raises pre-flop, they usually have something pretty decent because they're basically giving you good odds, right? I mean, notice here, your opponent's basically saying, my hand is so good that you cannot realize 24% equity in position. But like, obviously you're going to be able to realize 24% equity with almost anything, right? So if this is just your opponent's default raise and they're raising a lot, then I wouldn't think anything of it. But if your opponent does raise small from the small blind and this is perhaps abnormal, I would definitely think this is a strong-ish hand, right? You call, flop comes, king 9-9, opponent checks. All right, so now the opponent's range is probably going to be a lot of marginal made hands and hands that are looking to check raise, like a 9 or a king, and then an occasional junk hand, just like 6-5 of spades, right? It's just stone giving up. So when that is the case, when your opponent's range is going to be a whole lot of hands like premium hands, marginal made hands, and the occasional junk hand, you usually want to be betting very polarized. So that means your best made hands, like you want to be betting your 9s, maybe not even your bad kings, and you also want to be betting some draws. Now, what draws are available in this spot? You have the obvious gut shots, but I think the other draws you probably want to bet are just like junky backdoor draws, like 10-8 of clubs. I think that would be perfectly fine to bet in this scenario and then fold if you get raised. And you're looking to triple that hand a lot of the time if you turn additional equity. 10-7, though, I don't think you need to go for it with this hand. I think you just have better candidates to bluff. Basically, like every gut shot, backdoor straight draw, backdoor flush draw is a hand I'd probably be bluffing with in this scenario. And that's going to result in you not bluffing too often. Also, you don't really want to bet queen jack and queen 10 because those actually win at showdown sometimes. And they can easily call a turn bet. So I think those draws are just like too good to use as bluffs. Also, if you get check raised with a hand like queen 10 or jack 10, it's just miserable. And I mean, you can't really fold, but you probably should fold. Ugh, that'd be nasty, right? So whenever you kind of foresee that nasty spot coming, you'd rather just sidestep it. So anyway, I don't think I'd bluff this hand, but it's fine. Fine if you really feel like bluffing. Like if you tell me you think your opponent's range is very, very garbagey in this scenario, then you might as well just bet and pick up the pot. Turns of 5. Opponent now bets. I would just fold. You have nothing. Anytime you just have stone nothing, and your opponent's range on the flop included a whole lot of perhaps slow plays and marginal made hands like pocket queens, I just think you don't need to do anything in this scenario. Now you may say, well, if my opponent's range is a lot of bad kings and I can make those fold by the river if I get insane and like raise turn and jam river or call turn and then jam river over a raise, or I'm sorry, over a river bet, then like maybe then you can make your opponent fold everything besides the slow plays. I'm just not trying to do that kind of thing because some people just hero call you. In their minds, they're like, okay, my opponent would have bet a king or a 9 on the flop, and since they didn't bet the king or the 9 on the flop, I guess I just have the best hand with my pocket queens. And I keep kind of going back to that idea that I think the opponent's range is probably pretty good because they made it 2.5x pre-flop, which could just be totally wrong. That could just be a very wrong assessment. But I'm just not doing anything here. I'm just folding. Ooh, you decide to turn up the heat with a big raise. Okay, so this is a spot where when we want to discuss our turn raise sizing, we have to ask, are we raising the turn with the intention of betting the river, or are we raising the turn with the intention of giving up if we get called? Because I think those require very different strategies. So if we're raising giant in this scenario, like we are, we're essentially saying, if the opponent does call my turn raise, I'm going to be done with the hand, because in order for them to call my turn raise, they must have a king or a 9, or I guess a premium draw. I mean, obviously you lose to some of the premium draws like queen 10 of hearts, but you beat some of them like 7-6 of hearts, right? So if that's your strategy, I think that's fine. I would definitely not raise this size with the intention of going all in on the river, because I think that looks, well, first of all, like I said, when your opponent does call your turn raise, they probably have something very, very good. And if they have something very, very good, they're just not going to fold it on the river, right? They're not folding a king or a 9 on the river. So that would be my strategy from going for this big size. I think a better play, though, is to go more like 7 or 8 and then blast the river. And I think that's going to result in you getting called more often on the turn, which will give you a whole lot more fold equity on the river. Whenever you go this big, though, I think you do get a lot of the junk to fold. Well, a lot of the marginal made hands, like maybe even queens folds to a big raise. And if queens folds to a big raise, it means their range is very strong when they call you. And if their range is very strong when they call you, you shouldn't be bluffing the river. But if you raise small, it'll keep their range a little bit weaker, like they'll call with pocket sixes on the turn if you raise small. And then you can then blast that and get that off on the river. So you do raise big, you do get called. I would just be done here. I'm never bluffing any river. Opponent checks. I'm just still done with it. Now, if the opponent did have like 8-7, they may still hero call you if you jam river. And if you, like they had 7-6, they got there, right? So interestingly enough, if you are going to bet this river, you're essentially trying to get like ace-high flush draws and queen-high flush draws and jack-high flush draws to fold. So how much does that require? I think that requires like a 10 big blind bet or an 8 big blind bet. So I don't actually hate an 8 big blind bet. The problem, though, is that I think you're just going to be against a lot of kings here. And if you're just against a lot of kings, are kings really folding to any bet? I mean, no, right? I mean, your opponent would have to be really, really nitty to fold a king in this scenario. So I would literally never bluff here. You do bluff, though. Let's see if it works. It does not. Opponent probably just has like aces. Oh, ace-9. All right, sure. I mean, look, story checks out, right? They raised small pre-flop because ace-9 suited is great. They did slow play the flop. But like I said, they'd have some slow plays sometimes. Then they value bet turn, kept you in the pot with your whole range, which was smart. And then they let you bluff on the river. I think your opponent played this hand great. Besides the small pre-flop raise, I still would have raised this to like 3.5 or 3 big blinds pre-flop. But again, that's not that big of a deal. Your hand was just completely unnecessary, though. Like I said, just fold the turn, man. If you don't bluff the flop and your opponent bets the turn, just fold the turn. This idea of my opponent is so weak, so straightforward, etc., is not necessarily logical because they're not sometimes. Sometimes they just slow play, right? And when they slow play, they get you. And you may say, well, this only failed because they had exactly a 9. But if they had a king, I don't think it would have worked either. And if they decide to hero call you with an underpair, like 10s, it's also clearly not going to work. So, like, I think the turn raise actually could be viable. That's what I'm trying to say here, right? Like, I don't think this turn raise is awful by any means, because when you raise turn, if it does get queens and worse to fold, I think you're probably going to print a pretty good amount of equity with it. I would not have made this play, but I don't despise this play. But I think whenever you do raise a turn big and your opponent calls, I would never bluff river. Notice if you raise small, like 6 or 7 big blinds, you can then overjam the river, and I think that's going to get a whole lot more folds, especially if you keep your opponent's range weaker on the turn. But whenever you just have pot left on the river, your opponent's not going to fold a king, at least in my experience.